Hey there, TouchDesigner developers. Jack DiLaura here with the Interactive and Immersive HQ. In this video, we're going to focus on building some connectivity between TouchDesigner and the Stable Diffusion API. If you have yet to work with Stable Diffusion, it is a deep learning text-to-image model that will allow us to send a prompt over to its API, and then will generate an image for us, which we can then save on our local machine. So you can see here in the background, we have a generated photo of some architecture, and this has been, again, generated using our handy little component that we're going to build over the course of this tutorial. Just to show you the kind of real-time connectivity that we have to this API, if I hit this send request button again, after a second or so, we should get another image from the API, which will then display in the background. So as usual, we have a ton to cover in this video, and so we're going to get right to it. Let's go ahead and jump in. So like our previous video on GPT-3, we have to set up an account with the particular creators of this model to access the API to get our keys and our account to be able to use it. So the company behind this is called Stability.AI, and you can head to their website, Stability.AI, and you'll be greeted with this landing page here. So we're looking for the API specifically, and so I'm going to click that, which will bring us to this sort of documentation page for their API. The way that we're going to access, well, first of all, to create an account and then access our API keys and all that fun stuff is down here via the Dream Studio. So go ahead and click on that, and then it should bring you to another window where if you don't yet have an account, you can go ahead and sign up. So once you have signed up for an account, make sure to check your email. You should get some kind of confirmation with a link that will activate your account, and then you can come back to this page and log in with your new credentials. Now I'm going to head back to the documentation to walk you through this next part. One thing that I wanted to point out here is that just like the GPT-3 API, we do receive a number of tokens when we sign up for an account with Stability AI. In this case, we get something like $10 worth of tokens, which, although it doesn't seem like much, actually using the kind of recommended sort of lower resolution settings will give you somewhere in the range of like 500 images for free. Which again doesn't seem like necessarily a lot, but it can go pretty far for just kind of getting your feet wet with this API. So I've jumped back to the documentation because it has a good illustrated example of how to get your API key. Remember from our previous video, the API key it's almost like the password that enables you to work with this API to send these requests and receive an image back. So everyone's account will have a specific authentication code associated with it. With this particular platform, you can actually have multiple keys, as we'll look at. But anyways, this is just going to be a quick walkthrough of how to retrieve that for your account. So once you have created an account, you can log in to Dream Studio, and you'll be met with a page. Well, this is a portion of a page that looks something like this. You'll have a little icon in the upper right corner that might have an image if you used maybe a Google account or something like that, or it could just be the kind of initials of the email account. You'll click on that and then head to this My Account link, which then will take you to a kind of settings page for your account where you can access a number of things. Just like the previous APIs that we've looked at, you don't have to set this up with a credit card right away, which is nice. You can kind of use it with this kind of stipend of tokens without having to provide any of that info. So that's great. Anyways, moving on, we're going to click on the API key tab where you will have accessible your API key. And now, just like with previous APIs we've looked at, you need to make sure that you keep this a secret and don't, like publicly broadcast this or save it to a public GitHub server or something like that. So make sure that you store that in a safe place and don't sort of accidentally release it. However, if something were to happen, it is very easy to delete it and generate a new one with their little system that they've got set up here. So anyways, with that, just go ahead and copy that code and maybe save it in a text file on your machine. We're going to use it in TouchDesigner in a little bit. One final important bit of homework that you're going to have to do before we can get building things in TouchDesigner is to also install the Stability SDK package, which is an external Python library that allows you to access the Stability.AI APIs. So if you have yet to work with external Python libraries in TouchDesigner, I'm going to provide this link in the description below. That is from Matthew Reagan's website. He did a great tutorial or workshop rather at the TouchDesigner Summit in 2019, and there is an excellent write-up along with a GitHub repo that talks all about external Python libraries, why we should use them, how to set them up. And along with that, I believe there are some videos, perhaps? Yes, some videos of that actual workshop, so you can dive into it in even more detail and kind of follow along to really make sure that you have everything set up correctly. So you are going to need this complete before you can actually work with this SDK. So make sure that you go through this tutorial if you haven't already. And once you have done so, then you can open up the terminal or the command prompt in Windows and then run this line of code here, this pip install Stability SDK line of code, which is found on the Stability documentation under the text to image section. It's the first thing here. Make sure that that is installed before moving on, because otherwise the code that we're going to write will not function. Before we jump back into TouchDesigner, I just wanted to point out that all of the custom parameters that we are about to be making within TouchDesigner correspond with most of the settings that you'll see available in the Dream Studio website, where you should have just set up an account. So we are going to take and replicate a lot of these components within TouchDesigner, although not all of them, so that we can fine-tune the calls that we send to the API to generate images. So again, if you're curious kind of where we're getting our range of values or the particular parameter names from, this is all coming from Dream Studio. You can head to the documentation page and click on API parameters under features, and you can then see some definitions for each one of those parameters that we're going to be sending in to the API, and also importantly how that affects the pricing or the number of tokens that you are using to generate the image. So again, we're going to jump back into this and talk about it in more detail once we've got our custom parameters set up, but I just wanted to point that out now so that you can kind of get yourself familiarized with it. But with that, we can open up TouchDesigner and try to get it into the right window here and start our project. So before we get into building anything within our network, let's go ahead and create a project folder by hitting File, Create Project Folder. We're doing this because it easily allows us to set up a project directory along with asset folders. We're going to be generating images, so it's nice to kind of keep those contained into a folder. So first thing I'm going to do here is to set a path for this project. I store all of my TouchDesigner projects in a specific folder, so I'm just going to grab that one as the path here, and then I want to call this project Stable Diffusion plus TD, because that's what we're doing within this particular tutorial. I'm going to rename the TOE, the TOE file, to the same name as my folder. And then I'm just going to turn off the media folders that we can generate here, except for the images one I will leave on. From there, I'll hit create, and then I can hit save because I've got the directory now set up with the correct name for my TOE file. Boom, there we go. So we're all set with our folder structure and where it's saved on the computer. So with that, we can come back in to TouchDesigner. I'm going to close the palette, and then we can delete everything and start on our project. So if you've watched our video covering connecting to the GPT-3 API, everything that you see in this video should look familiar. We're going to kind of keep things focused on the technical aspects of setting up from scratch our own little system for connecting to the API, and leave the kind of experimental visual component for later videos. We're going to approach this again via a base comp with some custom parameters, and then we'll write some code that we'll place inside of that base comp to actually make the calls to the API. So we need to start off with that base comp first of all. So I'm going to add that to the network, and then I'll rename this to base stable diffusion, because that's the API we're going to be connecting to. And then we're going to need a couple of custom parameters for this base comp. So I'm going to right click on it and hit customize component, which will bring up the component editor window. So I'm going to add a page here, which you could call settings. I'll just call it Stable Diffusion API because, again, that's what we're doing. I'm going to click on that new page that we've created over on the right, and then we can start adding some parameters. So the first thing that we're going to need is a prompt. Since Stable Diffusion is a text to image generator, we obviously need to have some text in order to generate that image, and the prompt is the terminology that we use to describe that text. So I'm going to change this from a float to a string and then hit add parameter. There we go. There's our first parameter there. For our next parameter, we're going to add one called seed, and this is going to be an integer rather than a string. I'm going to click add parameter, and then I want that to fall below the prompt. So I'll move that down below the prompt, and we're just going to leave all of the range settings for that one alone because it can actually have quite a wide range of values. If you're not familiar with working with seeds, you can check out something like the noise top. It basically provides a value from which the generation of whatever content you're making starts from. And so in the case of Stable Diffusion, if we provide the same seed value, say number 1, and then we provide the same prompt and the same additional settings that we'll talk about in a moment, we should always be able to generate the same exact image. So it's a kind of way to either add randomness when we use the same settings, or to choose to kind of have a control value that allows us to maybe modify parameters in small amounts, or just to confirm that our settings are the same as they were previously. So anyways, that is just one of the parameters here that we're going to send with our API call. The next one is also going to be an integer. We're going to have two different values for this one. So we're going to set that to the number 2 here for our size. And the name of this parameter is going to be resolution. Now, the reason that we are not using the width and height data type here is that we want this to be an integer value. We don't want to have to do any typecasting in our code later on. So setting it up as an integer with a size of 2 allows us to do that without having to add some more coding for ourselves. So I'm going to hit add parameter there. And again, I'll move that down below seed. After that, we're going to have another integer. This one is going to be called CFG scale, which I'm not sure if that stands for configuration or something else, but this one essentially allows us to control how close of a result we have to our prompt. So it's like how close it tries to stick to the particular text that we are sending in, or how much creativity and randomness it is going to add in when it generates that value. So this is not going to be a size 2 integer. We're going to turn that size unit back to 1 and then hit add parameter. After that, we have steps, which again is going to be an integer. And for both the config scale, actually for the resolution, the CFG scale, and the steps, we're going to jump back here for a second and set up some range values, because the API is expecting these values to fall within a particular range. So for the seed and the prompt, we don't really need to worry about that. But once we come down to resolution, the minimum value that we can send in for the width and the height of our image is actually 512. So I'm going to start off here by setting a default for the first resolution parameter here to 512. I'm going to set the range minimum there to 512 and then the maximum here to 1024. Again, those are just kind of limited by the API in its current state. I'm also going to clamp these values because we don't want to ever send a call to our API with values that are out of range. So again, I'm just using the same exact values here of 512 and 1024. And then I'm going to do exactly the same thing for resolution 2. So we'll do 512, 512, 1024, and then I'm going to clamp the minimum and maximum, and again, 512, 1024. So just make sure that you have all of those things entered in correctly, and that will, again, change the scale of these parameters that we have set up. So assuming you've got that one entered in correctly, let's head to CFG scale. For this one on the website, it has a range of 0 to 20 and a default of 7. So I'm going to start here with the default and set that to 7. Then I want my range minimum here to be 0, my range maximum to be 20, and then I turned on my clamp min and max, and I will set the maximum here to 20. And then we'll move on to steps. So for steps, I set my default at a value of 15. I think it might start at something like 30, maybe 20 on their website. But I did this to basically use less tokens for my image generation. You kind of have to strike a balance between some of these parameters. I'm going to leave that default at 15. I'm going to set the range minimum here to 10 because that is what is available on the website. And then for the range max, we actually can go beyond a value of 50, but I'm going to set it to 50 because I wanted to kind of constrain myself to not using too many steps and thus more tokens when I'm generating my images. So you feel free to set this higher, but I'm going to do that to 50. Again, just so that I am being a little bit more conservative with my tokens. So that is it for the steps parameter. Our next one is going to be called num images. Now, I'm going to rename the label for this one, but that's what I want the parameter name to be called. It's going to be an integer again, so I'll hit add parameter. For the label here, I'm just going to set the text to number of images. It just makes it easier to reference in code when we use this shorthand for the parameter name. And then for this one, we have, again, the ability to adjust within a particular range. The default, I believe they had it set to 4 on the website, but I'm just going to do 1 for now because I don't need to be generating multiple images at a time. And for the minimum, again, 1, we need to generate at least 1 image. And the maximum here, I'm going to set to 9. And I'm going to clamp those values again because we can't really move beyond those. And with that, we have completed the numeric parameters, and we're going to move on to some of our additional parameters. We just have 2 more. The next one is going to be called our image directory. And so I will put, again, a shorthand here. So I'll do image img out dir for image out directory. And this one is going to be a, actually, I think we can do this as a string, but we could do this as a, no, actually we should do this because this is a particular folder. We want to use the folder data type there and then hit add parameter. And from here, I'm gonna, once again, increase the specificity of that label. So this is gonna say image output directory. And finally, we're going to add a pulse button, which is called send request. And that is going to be the trigger that sends the call to the API. and I'll hit add parameter. Now what I did for my particular interface or my particular set of parameters here is I went back to the image output directory and I turned on this section switch to kind of separate that from the these settings here, because those are related to the API call itself, whereas this is the kind of response from the API, the directory that we are receiving those files back to. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the send request. I'm going to make a separate section for that because that is, again, a sort of separate function from this. So with that, we actually have all of our custom parameters, and now we can move on to diving into code and kind of setting ourselves up for accessing the API. So we've got ourselves some custom parameters. The main thing that I'm going to do before we head inside of this operator, the kind of last step here, is to specify our output directory. We can do this in one of two ways. We can just type in the name of the folder, or we can hit the plus sign on the right, which will bring up the Explorer. I had set up the image asset folder at the beginning. If you haven't done so, make sure that you set up a location for your images now. I'll click on that and hit select folder, and then it will put the name of that folder in the output directory parameter. With that, we can head inside of this base comp and start working on some code. So first up, within our base comp, we're going to add a text stat. This is going to be the super secret and special location for our API key. Again, if you were releasing this publicly or maybe passing this off to a client, you might want a way to secure this key a little bit better, but we are doing this for kind of testing purposes on a personal machine, so this is okay for now. So I'm going to call this text space API capital K for key, and then I will paste my particular API key in there, and then we can move on. Next up, we have the parameter execute dat. So this is going to allow us to trigger some functionality when we hit the send request button on the base comp. So we need to, first of all, point this to the specific operator that it should be looking at the parameters of, and that in this case is the parent operator. So I'm going to do parent open and close parentheses, and then I need to flip that to the expression mode. So I'm going to click on the ops title here and flip it over to the expression mode really quick. Then I want to specify the parameter that I'm going to be looking for. And if we go back up a level, the name of this is send request. So that's a capital S and everything else lowercase. So I'm going to specify that parameter exclusively, just in case you were to add any additional parameters or hit any of the other built-in parameters. We're just kind of doing this as a fail-safe because that's really the only one that we need for our parameter execute. So from there, I'm going to turn value change off because we're just using a pulse button. And I'm going to turn built-in parameters off because we just want that one custom parameter. From there, I'm going to add in a text stat before we jump into that parameter executes code, which I'll place over to the right. This is going to contain the code that is going to be used to call or send a call to the API. So I'm going to rename this to text API call. I'm splitting it out this time so that it is just a little bit more organized, and we can simply call or run the function within this text stat rather than kind of adding a bunch of code to the parameter execute dat. So we have this set up with nothing in it at the moment, just so we can reference it within this parameter execute code and kind of know what the name of this dat is. So now I can open the parameter execute within an external code editor, and we want the onPulse function definition here. So when we pulse the send request button, first of all, let's just double check that this is the if parameter or par rather dot name equals send request. So again, that's just another double checking that we've got the parameter that we want. then we're going to do something. So what we want to do is to run the code within that new operator text API call that we just set up. So to do that, all we have to do is to reference that operator. So op, and that was op open close parentheses, single quotes, text API call. And then to run the code found within that text stat, we just type in .run open and close parentheses. We can save that, and then we need to open up the text API call dat in the code editor. So there we go. Now, the best thing for us to do is to head back to the documentation momentarily. We're going to do a little bit of copy and pasting, a little bit of tweaking of some demonstration code to generate some code for ourselves. So again, I was talking earlier about the API parameters and the fact that we have all of this information. Feel free to review this now to get a better understanding of all of the different parameters that we have available. We, as I mentioned when we looked at Dream Studio, we're not going to be using all of these for this particular example, but it is very straightforward to incorporate more of them if you so choose. What we are doing in this case is going to be doing text to image, so we can head down to that section. Okay, so here we are at our text to image reference page. First of all, we should have at the beginning of this video installed the Stability SDK package, so we have access to that library and can access the API in a very straightforward way. Also, make sure that you have set this to the Python language, which I think it should default to, but if not, just double check that at the top. From there, we have some dependencies and environment variables to set up. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this whole section to our text editor where we will paste that in. So we are importing a bunch of different things, all which are necessary for accessing the API. Again, we've already done this where we've signed up for an account. We've created an API key. So let's go ahead and delete these lines of code here. And then we have paste your API key below. Now, we actually don't need to do that because we have it stored in our text stat. So what I'm going to do here is to point to that text stat and grab the contents of it as text. So op, open and close parentheses, single quotes, text underscore API, capital K key. And then I want the output of that, or the contents of that, as text, so I will write .text at the end. So that will send over that information as a string and will function just the way that we need it to. So I'm going to save that, and then we can move on and back into the browser. So we have to set up or establish the connection with the API in this next section. So we have the ability here to choose the particular engine that we're using, to print messages and all that fun stuff. Again, I'm going to kind of delete some of this, some of these notes here because they just are taking up space. But if you're interested in any of these other libraries, which we are not, or engines rather, which we're not going to be using in this tutorial, you can take a look on the API parameters page for more details. So again, copy and paste that code in. And again, I'm going to delete some code here because I don't need it. I'm actually also going to make this a little bit wider because we're kind of running past our line length there. Cool. So with this code, we do not need to change anything. So we are good with that section. I'm just going to add ourselves a couple of new lines there to add the next section in. Let's go back. And here we can set up the particular parameters that we are looking to generate an image from. And this is where all of our custom parameters that we've set up in our base comp will come into play. So we're actually going to copy this whole thing eventually, but I think for now, let's just start off with this top section so that we don't end up with this huge jumble of code. So we're starting with set up our initial generation parameters and going to this parenthesis here. Stop before it says set up our warning to print to console if adult content classifier is tripped. So let's just get that first section, copy it, bring up the code editor again, paste that in. Okay, we've got a whole bunch of stuff here. This is probably looking a little bit overwhelming, but that's okay. We've got some notes which you can go ahead and read through if you want. But basically, we are just assigning, or we will be assigning the parameters that we've set up in our base comp to each one of these Python variables, and then sending that all to the API, which is going to use to generate an image. So we're just going to delete a lot of this demonstration comment or content that we have here and replace it with some Python that will grab the values from our custom parameters. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is delete everything from this line with our prompt in it, and then put that comma back in just so that I don't forget it. So first things first, I need to grab the prompt from the parameter called prompt from the parent component. And we're going to be doing all of this via f-string formatting because it needs to be sent into the prompt not as a kind of TouchDesigner Python object, but a string of information. So it's like we're converting it to the kind of data that the API is expecting. So for that f-string formatting, we're going to type in f and then some single quotes, and then we need some curly braces. For the prompt, we're going to, as I said, grab that parameter called prompt from the parent. So type in parent, open and close parentheses, .par to access the parameters. And then we need a custom parameter called prompt. So that's going to be capitalized. So let's go ahead and copy and paste what we've written here for the prompt parameter, and we'll use that for the seed as well. So I'm just going to select this seed, the number that is currently assigned to the seed, and paste in this f-string that we set up before. And I'm going to instead access the parameter called seed. Now, another thing that we need to do here is that we don't want this to be a string. We want this to be an integer that we're sending to this seed variable. So that will basically generate an error if we send it as is. So we need to make sure that we do that typecasting now. So the way that we do that in Python is we type in int for int, and then you'll want to put parentheses around this whole f-string formatted string that we have written there. So there we go. We now have that nicely wrapped with our integer conversion. And let's go ahead and copy this whole line because we're going to need to do the same sort of conversion for all of these other integer values. So for steps, again, I'm going to do the same thing here. Paste that in, change the parameter name here to steps, the CFG scale, paste, and the name of that was CFG scale with a capital C, no spaces. And then width, this one's going to be a little bit different because we have a size 2 integer. So the first parameter is going to be called resolution 1. And then for the second one here, we have a value or a name of resolution 2. So note that that is not resolution W and H, but 1 and 2 because we set that up as an integer. Finally, we've got our samples parameter, which is actually in terms of our base comp, the number of images that we are generating. So let's go ahead and paste that string in there again, and we want the parameter called num images. So that's it for our call to the API. The next thing that we need to do is copy one last section of code, which we're going to modify to save the resulting images to our local project folder. One other thing that I didn't mention here is that I have not included the ability to change this sampler setting because we're just kind of rolling with the default one. but you could assign this to a different sampler. There's a number of them that are available if you want to, and or set up a custom parameter in the base comp to do that. Anyways, moving on to our demonstration code, where we'll copy and paste this final section here and add that to our code. So I'm going to copy that, and then we'll paste that in. And you can see here that we have a number of things going on. So we are setting up a warning to print to the console, which is the text port in TouchDesigner, if the adult content classifier is tripped. So if we send in some kind of prompt with adult content, it will trip that and not generate an image. And then if it's not tripped, we want to save those generated images. So this is a way to just provide some sort of error or warning when that particular state occurs. Otherwise, you might not have any idea why you're not receiving an image back. So we're going to leave this section with the warning alone. That is fine as is. But this second section here, which actually saves the image to a particular folder, we need to modify, because right now it is not it's not saving it to the directory that we have set up within our custom parameters. So to do that, we basically just have to modify this section here called this image.save function, and we need to just change the location of that file, and we're going to modify the naming of it as well. So we're going to use f-string formatting once again. So I'm actually going to delete everything within those parentheses for the save function, and add the f with the single quotes and then some curly braces. I'll kind of scoot that up a little bit in case that little display gets in the way. So within the curly braces, we are looking for, once again, our parent with a parameter called img out directory. So that's img out dir. And then we're going to put a /, and then we're going to add another set of curly braces, and we're going to use the artifact.uuid. So the artifact is the basically part of our response that we receive back from the API, which includes our image and information about that image. And the UUID is a specific identifier that will be unique to each image. So the reason that we are using this as the file name here is because we want to make sure that we don't overwrite an image when we generate a new one. If we were to just leave it as like a specific name, it's not going to iterate through those names for us automatically. We could write functionality to do so, but having this unique identifier makes it convenient to get that same sort of functionality without having to do any additional coding. So we've got basically a directory within our string, and then we have the name of our image file. Now we need to finally add another little bit at the end here, .png, to save this as a PNG file. From there, we should be able to hit save and head back to TouchDesigner. Let's go ahead and save our TouchDesigner project as well, and then head up a level to our base comp. So we have basically all the code that we need to start generating images, and we can now provide ourselves a prompt and then see if our API connection is functional. So for the prompt here, we can specify basically anything that you can think of. There are tons of different articles and wiki pages and forum posts about crafting the perfect prompt for Stable Diffusion and other APIs that are out there. So it's definitely kind of becoming a sort of expertise of its own. So I definitely recommend checking those out to really fine tune and be able to generate the images that you're looking for. But let's say we wanted something like a generative geometric pattern, and we want it to be in the op art style, and maybe an oil painting, and then maybe some vibrant colors. We could pass all of those things into the prompt and see what sort of results we can get. For the CFG scale, that should default to 7. Again, the CFG scale is one to look at because this controls how close the image will try to follow this prompt, and how random and creative the model will be. So basically, the higher this value is on the CFG scale parameter, the closer it'll try to make the output to the prompt. I'm going to leave it at 7 since that is the kind of default. I'm going to leave my steps here at 15, number of images at 1, and then let's go ahead and just try the send request button and see if we get anything out. So you'll see, because of the current way that we have this set up, my TouchDesigner, my instance of TouchDesigner here, froze because it is basically taking over the single thread that is being used right now, and waiting for that response from the API and doing all that fun stuff in the background. And that is why we set up this base comp to be functional with the engine comp that I talked about just briefly at the beginning. The engine comp, if you're not familiar with it, allows you to use a tox file, an external tox file, and run that essentially as like a separate process within TouchDesigner. So it's almost as if you had like 2 instances of TouchDesigner running, and you can do this processing that might cause the single-threaded nature of TouchDesigner to kind of halt some animation or other things that you're doing within the software that can be kind of offloaded to this secondary process and ran in the background without affecting anything that is happening in your main sort of area within Touch. So that is a super, super useful functionality as we are working with things like APIs and additional functionality as well. But now that we have set this up, let's just go ahead and take a look that we got that output from this API call, and then we'll work on setting it up in the engine comp. So I'm going to open up the output folder and then head into the image folder, and there we go. This is the image that resulted. So that means that our connectivity to the API is indeed functional, and it is receiving the different custom parameters that we've set up, which is great. And we also have our unique identifier name here at the bottom, which again is great because we won't overwrite our files. So we have ourselves a functional API. Let's just go ahead and set this up to run with the engine comp. So the first thing I'm going to do here is right click and save this as an external component tox file. So I'm going to save component tox. I'm going to leave the name as the same as the comp here and hit save. And then I'll turn the cooking of this one off because we don't need to use it anymore, but we can go ahead and add the engine comp now, and then we'll see here we have the ability to choose a tox file, and there's the one we just set up. So I'm going to add that in to my tox file parameter. It'll start off with this little warning, which basically just says that it is loading the base comp in the background, and then we can head to the newly appeared Stable Diffusion API parameters page and see that we have exactly the same parameters available to us as we had within the base comp itself. So now that we've got that loaded up in the engine comp here, let's go ahead and hit the send request button and make sure to look down here at the bottom at the timeline for the difference compared to hitting it in the base comp itself. What we should notice is nothing has happened at all in this timeline. Everything just kept on moving. My frame rate has basically stayed the same, might fluctuate a little bit as I'm moving the mouse around because we're drawing the TouchDesigner interface. But if we take a look in the background at the Explorer window here, we actually have generated another image. So this example is just to show you that the use of a base comp set up with these custom parameters with the intention of being used with the engine comp is a super useful technique to kind of offload these processes that can take up some of your kind of single-threaded performance and push that processing somewhere else without having to have like 2 instances of TouchDesigner open. And allow you to make these calls to the API without dropping any frames or causing any freezes or things like that. So a quick place that you can start experimenting with your hopefully quickly amassing library of images is to head over to the palette and look under Tools for the Movie Playlist object, which I'll add. And that allows you to specify basically a folder of images or movie files and have a little player that will play them in a sort of slideshow format. So for my media folder, I can just type in image, which is the name of that folder. And then I should be able to hit initialize and start and see the 2 images that I have generated. So you've got a number of parameters that you can modify here, and then you could take this and build some different effects with it. But as I mentioned before, the focus of this video is more to get you set up with this very simple comp to start working with this API, and then we're going to focus on some creative applications in the future. So with that, we're going to close out the video. Hope you've enjoyed putting this one together. Thanks so much for watching. Looking forward to seeing you in the next video.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you're serious about taking your TouchDesigner and interactive skills to the next level, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. It's the only educational resource and community of its kind for TouchDesigner and interactive professionals. You can learn more by checking out the link in the description. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe and the little bell icon for more awesome free content.